Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Auspicious Elections podcast. Today is Sunday, April 28th, 2019, starting at 6:02 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, and this is probably the 22nd or 23rd episode of the show.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound right?
Something like that.
All right. Joining me today is Leisa Schaim.
Hi, Chris.
Hi. And I still have a cold, so my voice is recovering.
Yeah.
But we're going to power through these 6 amazing electional charts that you found for the month so people can get ready for May.
Definitely.
All right. So let's jump right into it.
Okay.
First, review. Usually at the beginning of these episodes, we do a little bit of review about things that we learned applying some of the electional charts from the past month. Are there any major things that we meant to touch on there that stand out?
Well, we just had a lot of kind of mini electional moments with setting up the new apartment.
Right.
Yeah. And so a lot of like, do we buy this now or in half an hour when the rising sign changes? Or do we contact the apartment management company about the things needing fixing right away now or in 2 hours when, things are better? So we had a lot of those.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the last episode, we already talked about trying to delay the showing and like first walking into the place until like the rising side had changed signs. But
right.
we actually failed in doing that. And it still was like 29 degrees of something rising.
Yeah.
But we did control pretty closely the signing of the final contract for the lease, as well as like one other document or something.
Yeah, just there were like so many little pieces. So signing the lease, which we did last month, and then the first moment for coming into the apartment, moving the first things in.
Yeah, even our first time like walking in as like new owners of the apartment, we ended up electing because we were trying to find what would be the most symbolically significant moment. And sometimes that's one of the important lessons in electional astrology that I repeatedly have to teach new students, is they're often trying to find that singular moment. But unfortunately, a lot of major ventures are like a series of important moments. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just to line up a series of charts and try to get all of them in as decent electional charts as you can for the various pieces of what that new venture is.
Yeah, definitely. And some things, only have like 1 or 2 major moments. But yeah, for this, I would say like signing the lease, trying to see the apartment for the first time, and then finally moving our stuff in for the first time, for which I packed like one light bag to be symbolically moving some of my stuff in.
Right.
While not having like 4 boxes the first trip.
Yeah. So that happened. I bought like a major piece of furniture at like IKEA, and for some reason we stalled for like 10 or 15 minutes so I could get a better rising sign.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we didn't write down a lot of these times, but there were definitely a lot of these. And that one was like, is it worth it to wait until about 15 minutes before the store closes in order to get this better rising sign?
Right.
But thankfully, we both agreed that we should do that. So
yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff surrounding that. And then later, we had a funny thing at a local astrology group meeting happen this month where we had a guest speaker who was coming in from out of town, actually from out of the country, to give a talk for our local astrology group. It was going to be a huge meeting with over 40 people attending, which is pretty large for our group. And most of the past month, as soon as Mars went into Gemini, it kind of started messing up the Virgo rising elections, because then it put Mars in the 10th whole sign house.
Right.
As you can see, I guess it's not there now, but imagine Gemini is rising in the chart, or imagine Virgo is rising. And Mars is going through Gemini, so it ends up in the 10th house. And then at some point, while Mars is going through the 10th whole sign house, the midheaven, the degree of the MC, will eventually conjoin Mars exactly. So at this meeting, it was scheduled to start at 3, and we noticed that at like 3:01 or 3:02, the ascendant would switch from Leo rising to Virgo rising.
Yeah.
So we knew ahead of time that we actually kind of wanted to push to make sure that we started promptly on time so that we could get Leo rising and not end up with Mars in the 10th house. And things got delayed, and we actually ended up rushing and like trying to start at the very last minute with like 29:50 Leo rising or something like that. And I went up and started introducing the speaker, but of course, by the time he got up there and started talking, it had already switched to Virgo rising. So I think we failed. And what was funny is we sort of saw the result of that pretty immediately, because this had never happened before in the history of the group. But at one point, what was it? Couldn't have been more than like halfway into the lecture. Somebody raises their hand as if they have a question, and then they start kind of heckling the guy or like really strongly criticizing the speaker
Hmm.
in very not uncertain.
Right. And kind of like strident terms.
Yeah.
Like, you should be talking about this, and why aren't you talking about this?
Yeah. And it
Yeah.
was really disruptive. And it was this guy, it was only like this guy's like fourth talk ever.
Hmm.
So he was kind of thrown off by it and tried to deal with it. And then it got really uncomfortable for like the rest of the audience because we're all sitting there. And at one point I tried to intervene, but the disruption kind of set the tone for like the rest of the talk and almost put a bit of a cloud over it in some sense.
Right.
And what you noticed right away was that Mars had exactly conjoined the degree of the midheaven right when that person like interrupted, basically.
Yeah, I checked it after she was talking for like a minute or two. I was like, oh, Mars on the midheaven, because I always check this, and it's a great educational thing when things kind of weird like that happen. If you have like an app on your phone or something like that where you can check what the chart of the moment is right at that point, it's often really educational because usually things are hitting angles when like there are major events happening in your surroundings.
Yeah, and that's crucial. And we both use Astro Gold on our phones for that, and it's really useful because then it's like having the Solar Fire Animate feature right on your phone.
Right. And so those are really useful, not only just to see how they play out, but it's useful sort of in a backwards way in terms of electional astrology, because you learn how sometimes these things express themselves in real time, and therefore what not to do or what to emphasize when you're actually proactively choosing charts for electional astrology.
Right. Yeah.
And I've actually seen this one as kind of like the most reliable to me ever. Like Mars in a day chart hitting the angles. I've seen it with disruptions like over and over. And yeah, that actually happened at UAC as well. And I was doing a lecture on electional astrology at UAC.
Mhm.
And then I can't remember if I'd already done my lecture. I think I had. And then I was sitting in someone else's lecture, and Mars hit an angle, and there was a major disruption, just like the one you were just talking about.
Of like an audience
Yes.
member like trying to take over the lecture.
Yes, exactly. And they just kept talking, and finally, like about half the audience had to be like, "Okay, we get it already. Let the lecturer continue."
Right.
So yeah, that one's actually super reliable. But anyway, just the broader point is just really interesting to watch when things like that happen in your immediate surroundings and see what the chart is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So this is, for those watching the video version, is not the chart for the event. This is just the chart for today, but it's close enough where I just want to demonstrate for those that need to see it visually, like exactly what we're talking about. So we started the meeting and he started his talk with probably like 0 degrees of Virgo rising, and the midheaven was maybe still in the MC, the degree of the MC was maybe still in Taurus at that point. But Mars was already in the 10th whole sign house, or the 10th sign relative to the rising sign. So what happened is, as he went through his talk, the degree of the midheaven continued, it inched closer towards Mars until eventually the degree of the midheaven caught up to and conjoined Mars exactly. And that was the moment when the person interrupted the talk.
And sometimes, like around now, it's kind of a double whammy, because like the ascendant will be squaring Mars around the same vicinity as when Mars hits the midheaven as well.
Right. In our location.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. Like, it was annoying at the time. I don't even care at this point because it was more of like an interesting chart example. So I almost appreciate it on that level.
Right.
There was another funny thing though, where like a week later, that person we'd never seen before, and I think it was her first time attending the astrology group, and she promptly like hightailed it out of there immediately after the meeting was over. So we didn't even get to talk to her to find out like what her problem was or anything like that, and try to smooth things over. But
so we went out to eat, like, I don't know, a few days or a week later or something.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it was the next Saturday, right?
Something like that.
We met up with an astrologer who was like in from out of town, and it must have been like a week later. And we just went to like a restaurant that we've been to every once in a while in Denver. Yeah. We've taken like other people from out of town too. And we order, and the food's brought out, and the woman that brings out our food is like, she's like, oh, it's you guys.
Right.
And it's the same woman who like interrupted the lecture. And it turns out that she's a waitress at this restaurant that we sometimes go to. And we
Yeah.
had no idea.
Right.
And then we started talking about it and it was a little awkward, but I tried to like smooth things over and say, if you ever want to give a talk on that topic, like we're always looking for new speakers because I didn't want to like completely shut down whatever point she was trying to make. I actually genuinely felt like if she was that passionate about it, then we would love to host her for a talk. But that even if it was but the main thing was just that it was kind of inappropriate, the lengths to which she sort of interrupted the lecture.
Right.
To make that point.
And then I look at the chart after our food is deposited and we're done with that interaction. I'm like, what is the chart right now? And it was the same chart.
And Mars was exactly on the midheaven again.
Yes.
When we ran into her again this other time.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that means. We're still trying to figure out what that means.
I mean, it probably, in all likelihood, means that Mars is strong in her natal chart, if nothing else.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a pretty good guess. I would guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to be continued. We'll see if there's any further developments in this story, but
Right.
that's parts 1 and 2 so far.
Yeah.
And I think it reinforced something we already knew, which is don't put Mars in the 10th house in a day chart.
Definitely.
But then sometimes probably there's some broader implication we can draw from that of the whole sign placement sets up a potentiality for something, but then sometimes when an angle hits that by transit, it can activate it if it's just a short-term thing that you're talking about in terms of the election or the venture or the event.
No, definitely. Yeah, I've seen that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So that's our one good example that we wanted to really highlight before we get into the elections for next month. But with that out of the way, is there any other stuff?
Just general May notes.
Okay. All right. So let's transition to May. So what are we looking at for electional charts for this coming month?
So May is interesting. Most of the better charts are going to be late in the month, and it's actually pretty strikingly better later in the month. And the reason for that is both the Mars-Jupiter opposition and Venus square Saturn and Pluto are both very close early in the month, definitely the first week or so. And then, so those are kind of like the pitfalls, but then in addition and in contrast, there's several planets that will be in good dignity later in the month. And so it's like the early part of the month in contrast has these kind of like unfortunate aspects, plus those planets just not even being in great signs for them, versus later in the month, mid-month, Venus moves into its own sign of Taurus. So great time for Venus elections, very strong in its own sign of Taurus. Mercury moves into its own sign of Gemini the last third of the month, around May 21st. And there's a Sun-Mercury cazimi right away in Gemini, May 21st.
Nice.
And then just a note, this isn't a piece that makes it better later in the month, but Mars ingresses into Cancer mid-month, and that does begin opposing Saturn and Pluto by sign, which will be much more prominent in June. So that's just something to be aware of, not a point in favor of later in the month. But basically, Venus and Mercury vastly improve in condition the second half of the month, and there's some things you want to avoid the first half, and so it pushes a lot of the elections later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So most of the really good charts that you found this month are in the second half of the month due to that?
Exactly.
Got it. All right. Any other preliminaries?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay. Well, let's take a look then at what the first chart is for the month.
Okay. So that's going to be May 11th, around 9:15 p.m., and that puts about 6 degrees of Sagittarius rising on the ascendant. And let me pull that up. Yeah, so May 11th, 9:15 p.m. So Jupiter is in its own sign of Sagittarius in the first. We did talk about this a bit ago. You know, now that Jupiter is retrograde, it's not quite as positive as Jupiter direct, but it's still in its own sign. So it's still positive, and we still can make that the ruler of the ascendant. And just to kind of get that out of the way, because we will be using some of that.
So this is another grand fire trine
Exactly.
chart?
Yes.
That's funny because the one last month that we highlighted, I think it was the main election we highlighted for the month, right? And that ended up being the one that fell weirdly on like the Game of Thrones season premiere. And then I noticed there was just like astrologers that day like falling all over themselves to do elections. And
Yeah.
you saw like I saw like 20 different astrologers using that chart for electional purposes
Yeah.
a few weeks ago, which is funny.
Yeah, I did too. That was funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
we've got another one of those.
yes, we've got another one of those. So that's the
Okay.
first chart of the month. It's Jupiter in its own sign in the first house. This is a night chart because the sun hasn't quite gotten far enough in the zodiac to make it a day chart. So again, that tones down Jupiter a little bit, but still in its own sign. So that's good. The moon is in later Leo in the ninth house. And it's applying, at least here, by trine to Jupiter. And then after that, it will trine Venus. And so you don't actually need to worry if the moon Jupiter aspect is already separating in your location. Since this is a night chart, it's great anyway if the moon is applying directly to Venus, since Venus is the most positive planet in a night chart.
Right.
So kind of don't worry. It just happened to still be applying closely to Jupiter here. And so that's what we're doing, but it'll apply to both of them.
Yeah. And if you wanted to, you could almost even delay the election, put Jupiter on the ascendant or something and make it so that the moon is separating from Jupiter by then from like 23 Leo to applying directly to Venus so that it's also enclosed.
Right. Yeah, you could do that. I think the exact time was chosen here to mitigate the sun in the 6th. And so I have the sun trine the midheaven at 22 degrees.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And the sun is the ruler of the moon. So anyway.
What was the exact time again?
So this was 9:15 p.m.
Okay. So for other locations, you just want to make sure you have Sagittarius rising and then put the midheaven so that it's configured to the sun at 21 Taurus within 3 degrees.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, if you didn't care as much about the sun being mitigated, you could, do like you said, Chris, and just delay the time. And so the moon is directly applying to Venus. So there are a couple different options on exact timing.
Right.
Yeah. The nice thing about this, this is still, it's not early in the month. This was kind of the earliest I could get. So Mars is separating from its opposition to Jupiter by about 5 degrees, 4.5 degrees now. But it is a night chart too. So that tones that down as well, which is great since Mars is angular in the 7th house.
Right. It sets it up for the potential for conflict with others with Mars in the 7th, although it's mitigated because it's a night chart. So Mars is less malefic, and also there's some mitigation from Venus in that close sextile to Mars, overcoming it in a night chart.
Exactly. Yeah, and I really like that too, that close sextile. It does have reception as well with the sextile, so that makes it even better. And Venus is like not in great shape in this chart, but at least it's separating from the square to Saturn and Pluto. It's separating from Saturn by about 6 degrees and Pluto by about 3 degrees. So at least it's separating rather than applying, because it was applying for the first part of the month.
Okay.
Yep.
So not a good chart for financial stuff?
Not a good chart for financial stuff. Night chart, Saturn in the 2nd house. It's in its own sign, but still not the best for finances. It would be good for, well, it's tough because Venus, is a little bit challenged, but it's still a night chart, so Venus is better. So we could say that like 5th house matters could go okay with Venus there and having reception with its ruler. But it does have the overcoming square from Saturn. So, Jupiter in its own sign in the 1st house is great for anything involving appearance and what else, like kind of putting your own identity forward in various ways. Yeah. Yeah. So I would just use it not for financial things.
Okay. All right. That looks like a pretty good chart. So that's our first chart for May. Are there any variants or anything?
Not really. With a lot of the later charts, you can play with them, although I haven't given an exact variant for each one, but this one, no, not so much.
Okay. So what's the next chart after this?
So the next one's going to be May 21st. And this is May 21st around 2:25 p.m., which puts 22 degrees of Virgo rising on the ascendant.
2:25?
2:25 p.m. on May 21st.
Yeah, you were not lying about charts being in the later part of the month.
Yeah, no, I wasn't at all. And I think I went back too just to double check and make sure I didn't miss anything. But I mean, if anyone goes through meticulously the month and checks through again, you'll see kind of like why it landed that way.
Okay.
Yeah. But there are a bunch at the end of the month, so I gave you a lot of choices, even though they'll be later.
So don't do anything in the first half of May.
There's like one on May 8th. You could get a simple like moon sun sextile, but it's nothing amazing,
All right.
I'm not saying don't do anything, but you have, these are primarily if you have special things that you're trying to plan a little bit in advance.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay, so May 21st to 25 p.m., Virgo rising. So this is the day of the Mercury, the Sun Mercury Cazimi in Gemini. And so they've both just ingressed into Gemini. Mercury is in its own sign, which is great. And then they're super close in degree. And so that makes it a really strong Mercury election, Mercury ruling the first house and the 10th house.
Mm-hmm.
Then the moon, we'll talk about the moon here. The moon is in Capricorn, and it is applying by trine to Venus in Taurus in the 9th house. Now, the moon here is somewhat closely opposing Mars. It's separated by about 3 degrees, and that's really the main downside of this particular chart. And that's also part of why I picked a later ascendant degree, because you have some time range in here in Virgo rising. And while I could have put, and you could put the Sun Mercury Cazimi exactly angular, like on the midheaven and close to squaring the ascendant, the moon's about a degree or degree and a half closer to Mars at that time. And so part of what I did with this chart was do a later ascendant degree and put Jupiter angular instead, Jupiter on the IC and square the ascendant in a day chart, which emphasizes Jupiter, which is great. It just, because the Sun Mercury Cazimi, it's already prominent. It is in the 10th house. And that way you could get the moon like about a degree further away from Mars.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so here, the time, if they didn't want to do that, at least in our location, would be 12:55.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be with early Virgo rising in the midheaven at like 0 degrees of Gemini conjunct the Sun and Mercury at 0 degrees.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I would normally do, if not for sort of being a little concerned about the moon.
I guess I'm just concerned. The only thing I don't like about that is it puts Neptune like right on the descendant.
It does put it close, yeah.
Or close to the descendant. It is nice having Jupiter on the IC, though.
It is. It really depends on which piece you're most concerned about. And I really didn't like the moon being only a couple degrees from Mars, even though it is separating in both cases. I was just like, just buying some time here, get the moon a little bit further from Mars.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's separating and it has reception, so you're still going to get the opposition no matter what.
You are.
Yeah, I don't know. It could go either way.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it really depends on, I mean, I just felt like the Sun Mercury Cazimi was already fairly prominent, but yes, if you wanted to even focus in even more intently on that, you could certainly put it on the midheaven at an earlier time.
Sure. Versus if you want to focus more on either the outcome of the matter or on 4th house matters, you could use this time to emphasize Jupiter in the 4th.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another nice thing now that the Sun and Mercury have ingressed into Gemini is that they're applying by sign to Jupiter for a while now, which, suddenly some of these things make the charts a lot better compared to before.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so that's that one.
So the major downside is Mars in the 11th house of friends and allies? Yeah,
definitely. And it is nice that it has reception with the moon, but yes, Mars in the 11th in a day chart could bring some conflict with, associates, with friends. Not a chart to use to like start a group or something like that. But it is a good chart particularly for mercurial matters. So communication type things. So writing or speaking or things like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then the moon applying to Venus in its own sign in the 9th is kind of nice as well for 9th house matters, higher education and, religion, philosophy type of things, even though, Venus is not the better benefic during the day, but it's still strong in its own sign and the moon's applying closely to it.
Right. That's nice.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, this would be a good chart for I've used elections like this that you get about once a year where you can do like Virgo rising with Mercury and Gemini for writing, for public speaking, for 10th house matters pertaining to career, reputation, other things like that. This one's
Definitely.
unique because it then also has the nice fourth house stuff going on as well for the home and living situation or for the outcome of the matter in some instances.
Exactly. And even though Neptune is somewhat close to the descendant, at least if you choose to use the later time, which you don't have to, Jupiter does rule it. And then that's the Jupiter that's, really strong in its own sign of Sagittarius in a day chart on the IC.
Didn't we run into that? Because that was a whole issue we were dealing with a lot of our Virgo rising elections over the past month or two, where Mercury was the best we could come up with. But sometimes there were issues with like the other party attempting to deceive you with like Neptune in the 7th.
Yeah, although I can't remember whether that was before or after Mars ingressed into Gemini,
Okay.
because then that was an issue with Virgo rising.
Right. Got it. All right. I was just thinking of some of because we ended up using Virgo rising for some of the apartment stuff.
Yeah.
And then the leasing company just being kind of weird.
Yeah, definitely. I do feel like some of the Neptunian thing was visible in that way.
Right. And like finding out afterwards that like oh, like all of the light bulbs are burnt out in 90% of the house, or
yeah.
Weirdness.
There was weirdness.
Yeah. Or like, oh, the price is actually a lot higher than what we put in the advertisement.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and those were interesting Neptune in the 7th examples that can be more widely applicable, because we were like, well, we can't tell whether this is deliberate deception or just spaciness or like not being on top of things.
Right.
And sometimes you can't ultimately tell with Neptune.
Yeah, it could have gone either way.
Yeah.
All right. So is that it for this chart?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's chart number 2. What's chart number 3?
Chart number 3 is a few days later, May 24th. And that's going to be around 1:36 p.m. with 15 degrees of Virgo rising. So again, another Virgo rising. Gemini and Virgo rising at this point are great because of the Mercury in Gemini in its own sign ruling the ascendant.
Right. So you're just like using Virgo rising or even Gemini rising for like a lot of stuff.
Exactly.
Towards the end of the month.
Yeah. And I also looked through the Taurus rising. I think I have one Taurus rising coming up. One of the things I found with this month's elections is, while it's really awesome when a few planets around the same time start ingressing into their own signs, you can make the ascendant ruler really strong, but then sometimes the other planets don't cooperate in terms of like having a good moon application at the same time or things like that.
Right.
Yeah. So you'll see that in a few of these charts. Actually, this one is one of those. So Virgo rising, Mercury and Gemini in the 10th house. So really strong ascendant ruler there. The moon is in Aquarius. It is in the 6th house, which is not ideal, but it is enclosed. It is recently separating from its square with Venus and now applying to a sextile with Jupiter, and it is a day chart. And so that's the most optimal enclosure, because it's not only in between the aspects of Venus and Jupiter, but it's applying to the better benefic of the sect, which is Jupiter here.
Right.
And I did pick the exact time here, and you can alter your time and your location based on the midheaven, because I was trying to mitigate this moon in the 6th here by placing it trine the midheaven. And so you don't have to have 15 Virgo rising. You can mess with that and see, what time you need to do within Virgo rising so that the moon is closely aspecting the midheaven.
So this is a chart where the degree of the ascendant doesn't matter so much. Just try to put the ascendant anywhere in Virgo in your location, whatever city you're in, but try to make it so that the degree of the midheaven is trining the degree of the moon within about 3 degrees.
Exactly. Yeah. And so this one, there were some judgment calls near the end of the month because there are some really strong planets and signs here. But in terms of like lining up the houses and the moon applications, sometimes it was a little bit awkward.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, because the moon is actually applying to Jupiter, which is an angular benefic, that's the other thing that you can do if you can't get the moon configured to the midheaven. That's just is the next best thing, basically. So even if you can't get the midheaven closely configured to the moon in this chart, it would still be usable because it's applying within 3 degrees or 13 degrees to Jupiter.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's great. This is it's the same rising sign as the last chart. And so again, Jupiter in the 4th in Sagittarius makes for really good things regarding home and family, as well as potentially partnerships since it rules the 7th. And, again, the strong 10th house, ascendant ruler in the 10th, Mercury in its own sign. So you can definitely still use this for career matters, writing, speaking, etc. Yeah.
And 11th?
Yeah, and so the same downside with the 11th. So Mars in Cancer, just like in the last chart. So not the best chart to use if you are trying to do things with groups or associations or friendship.
Right. So use this chart if you want to destroy friendships or sever alliances.
Well, try to just avoid those topics for this.
Yeah, if you can.
Yeah. Also, shared resources, not great because it rules the 8th.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's a little mitigation because Venus is sextile Mars again and overcoming it. But that's not a huge mitigation.
Right. It might help a little bit, but you still wouldn't want the focal point to be on 11th house topics.
Right. Yeah. All right. That looks good. So that's chart number what? 3? 4?
Chart number 3, I believe. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the next?
So the next one is going to be the next day. So May 25th, around 5:59 a.m.
And we're in Norwalk territory at this point, right?
Yes, a lot of these dates are within Norwalk.
I mean, which one of these is the podcast event that's happening there?
Do you know what day that is?
It's the Thursday night at 8:30 p.m.
Let's see.
Well, I guess this is...
Thursday night is going to be...
This is Saturday, so...
Yeah, Thursday night's 23rd.
Okay.
So it's kind of in between these.
And then it's also in Seattle.
Yeah.
So the location... All right, I don't know. I can't pull that up. Well, no, actually, remember it has... Sagittarius rising. That's why we're delaying it a little bit. It's starting late at 8:30. Partially to give the people in the pre-conference workshops time to go out to dinner first, and also to give us time to set up, but then also secondarily to get Sagittarius rising. So that's actually our electional chart for the live podcast recording with Austin and Kelly at Norwalk.
Oh yeah, that looks good.
Yeah, we got the sun, even though it's so late. Somehow we still end up with a day chart with Sagittarius rising at 8:30 at night.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Moon is in Aquarius, applying to a trine with Mercury at 5 Gemini, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and that's nice things there.
All right, so back to your chart. It's 2 days later on the 25th.
May 25th, around 5:59 a.m., which is 8 degrees of Gemini rising. As an aside, I really like the spectrum of times of day for charts this month because sometimes they're all either really late or really early. And so it's nice that there's a little bit of variety here in terms of, whether you're willing to stay up really late or get up really early in the morning.
Right.
Yeah. So this one is...
Did we do any really early or late ones this month? Didn't we stay up really late or wake up really early to sign the lease or something?
We did that one, although I think we maybe talked about that one last month already. But yeah, we did wake up really early for us, really early.
Right.
Some people do not consider early. I think it was around 7 a.m.
I mean, it was around sunrise.
Yeah, I think we had to get up around then, but signing was around 7 a.m.
Okay. It's plenty early.
It is, I agree. So this is a Gemini rising chart. So similarly using the Sun and Mercury in Gemini, but from the Gemini rising instead of Virgo rising, as with the last couple charts. So Mercury is right on the ascendant in Gemini, and the moon is in later Aquarius in the 9th house, and it's applying by sextile to Jupiter in the 7th house. And Jupiter, this is a day chart, so this is just after sunrise. I actually think even if you just got Gemini rising, the sun is so close in degree that it probably would act like a day chart no matter what. But just in case, you might want to make sure that it's at least 4 degrees of Gemini rising so that the sun is above the ascendant. because we want to make Jupiter really positive since it's both angular and the moon is applying to it. And also the other major reason was because Saturn is ruling the moon. And so we wanted that to be a day chart Saturn ruling the moon instead of a night chart.
Right.
Yeah. So let's see. This one I was mostly focused in terms of the exact timing with Mercury on the ascendant and just making that Mercury really strong. But it happens in this location, at least, that Venus is square by a few degrees the midheaven, which is nice, although not essential. But it does mitigate it a little bit from its 12th house cadent position. Jupiter is strong in its own sign. Now it's directly in the 7th house, so partnership matters would be pretty positive with this chart, especially with the moon applying to it. Also ruling the 10th house of career and public standing. So that would also be a positive area. But this would be like a super strong Mercury election, really.
Yeah, Mercury's in really good shape in this chart.
Mm-hmm.
And the moon's applying to Jupiter, but it looks like it's pretty close. So
Yes.
some people west of Denver might have trouble getting the moon still applying to Jupiter.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that because that actually cropped up with a few charts, and I was really like, oh, but these are positive charts that you want to use if you can. But if you can't, I did look at, what would happen if you moved it back a day, and you could still, if the moon is already past Jupiter when Gemini is rising on the 25th for your location, you can back it up a day. And the moon then will likely be applying to square Venus first before going on then afterwards to sextile Jupiter.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, exactly. Still applying to benefics.
Right. Yeah, that looks good. So alternative or variant for the same rising sign in the same chart is just May 24th at the same time, just after sunrise?
Exactly.
Okay. And in terms of problematic stuff in the chart?
Problematic is going to be financial matters primarily, with Mars in the 2nd in a day chart. But now you see also that that Mars is, paying attention to the Mars opposing Saturn and Pluto. And oftentimes there'll be some crossover topics between those two opposing houses. So in this chart, for instance, Mars is in the 2nd house of individual finances, and then Saturn and Pluto are in the 8th house of shared finances or resources.
Right.
And so just not a good chart for finances, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, but for any sort of mercurial things, writing or speaking in particular, as well as career or partnership, this would be great.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a super strong Mercury election. Probably, I want to say one of the best Mercury elections of the year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And that's why the end of this month is so nice, because you can really focus in on using the strong planets in their own signs as ascendant rulers and just making them very focal.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so that's a nice Mercury one.
All right. What is next?
Next one. So we've got a lot of charts this month, but they're all bunched up at the end. So May 27th, around 4:51 a.m., and that is going to be about 20 degrees of Taurus rising.
20 degrees?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And this one, so similarly, but different rising sign, we have Venus strong in its own sign of Taurus ruling the 1st house. And so this is a strong Venus election. Moon is in mid-Pisces in the 11th house, and it's applying closely by sextile to Venus. And this is, as you can see, it's applying pretty closely. And so it was another one where it was difficult because I wanted to use it, but not every time zone will necessarily get this. But again, you can, if this doesn't work for you, if the moon is already past Venus by this time in your location, you can do the same thing as the last one. You can just back it up a day. It won't be, quite as strong, but it'll still be good.
Right.
And it'll just put the moon in early Pisces.
I mean, even if it's separating from Venus, where normally you would want to get it applying to Venus if you can.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you could back it up a day to May 26th and then just do Taurus rising again.
Mm-hmm.
Even once it starts separating from the sextile with Venus, it starts applying to the square with Jupiter, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So it's like enclosed by the benefics at that point, which is still pretty good.
It's still good.
It's just not as good because it's a night chart, and so therefore it wouldn't be applying to the most positive planet.
Exactly. And it wouldn't be applying to what we're really emphasizing in this chart, which is by putting Venus ruling the ascendant in the first house. That's kind of like the focal point, but it would certainly still be a good chart if it was applying to Jupiter.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. So this is a good Venus selection for like artistic matters, for relationships, for uniting people and things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And even this one would be a decent groups, because we've been kind of ruling out like groups in some of the elections or friendship matters when Mars was in the day chart in the 11th. So this one would actually be decent for groups, because not only Venus being a general significator for unifying people or things in the first house, but also Jupiter ruling the 11th and the moon having reception with Jupiter and then applying to either Venus directly or Jupiter.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And the second house isn't bad because Mercury's in its own sign in the second. So this is actually a better financial one.
So this is like one of the few good financial elections?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it has Mercury and Gemini in the second house, relatively well situated, not afflicted. It's one of the rare cases where you have both the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the second in good shape.
Yeah, exactly. That doesn't always happen. And now, you put Mercury in the second and then Jupiter in the 8th. And so both financial houses are good.
Right. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Is that the last chart?
I think there is one more.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, May 31st, around 11:33 a.m. And that's going to be about 26 Leo rising.
11:33 a.m.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this one is going to be, and again, this is another one where you can kind of play with times, exact times, but it is a Leo rising chart. Sun in Gemini in the 11th house, and it's opposing Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 5th house. And the moon is in, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up that chart there. Okay, the moon is exalted in Taurus in the 10th house, so really prominent. It is applying by sextile to Mars in the 12th first, which is not exactly what I was going for, but at least it does have reception with that, and it's only a sextile, and then goes on to conjoin Venus also in Taurus in the 10th house. And so I was really trying to get a pure moon Venus in Taurus election, and this is pretty close. It does sextile Mars first, but it really still does emphasize the moon and Venus in the 10th in Taurus.
Yeah. That looks good.
Yeah, as well as...
the moon is ruled by Venus.
Exactly. So the moon and Venus have reception and so forth. This is actually also very close. The Venus just barely has passed to the exact trine to Saturn. And so it's like a really kind of strong solidifying Venus election, because not only is Taurus a fixed sign and moon and Venus are there, but it's Venus trine Saturn very closely. And it's a day chart, so it's a constructive Saturn. So that's actually pretty nice, I feel like.
Yeah, that is really nice.
Yeah. So kind of like for sort of lasting, emotional bonds or personal bonds and things like that.
Right. Also a good 11th house chart.
Yes, a good 11th house chart, because the ascendant ruler is the sun in Gemini in the 11th, and then applying to Jupiter there in the 5th, although it will square Neptune first, but we can't avoid that these days. Mercury is just a bit past its opposition with Jupiter, unfortunately, and that does rule the 11th, but the sun is still in the 11th applying to Jupiter, so that's good enough.
Right.
Yeah, so I actually really like this one.
Yeah, that's a pretty good chart.
And one more thing. Saturn is ruling, part of why I chose the exact time here, even though the ascendant degree is so late, is to get the midheaven around 19 degrees of Taurus. One, to put Venus there, so it's like a really prominent Venus on the midheaven, but also secondarily to put Saturn trine the midheaven, because not only is it in the 6th, but it's ruling the 7th house. And so if you're really trying to use this for like a solidifying personal relationships kind of thing, then you want Saturn a little bit mitigated as well.
Right. I like that. Not a good 12th house election.
Right. Not that many people do 12th house elections, but yes.
Right. Not good for enemies.
Not good for enemies. I mean, it's also ruling, Mars is ruling the 4th and the 9th. And so maybe things involving home and family, not the best use of this election, as well as 9th house, potentially long distance travel or studies or things like that.
Right. Education.
Yeah, education. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, that's always an issue. Like a question that sometimes comes up or that students have about whether having a really difficult malefic in the 12th house indicates like the native having more problems with enemies, or the enemies of the native having problems and dying or something.
Exactly.
But I've seen instances where it goes either way, but most of the time it's actually more problems towards the one initiating the thing coming from 12th house people.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I think you'd have to really experiment that with a lot with that. And then also it's hard to test it because 12th house is unseen matter. So sometimes you might not even be able to observe what the results are.
Right.
Or at least right away.
That is part of the issue.
Yeah. I did have just one variant of this, just in case people wanted to. I know we're on the last day of the month, but just in case.
I am in a collapse. Let's
do this. I'm sorry.
All right.
Okay, so I do think that actually the stronger one is the primary May 31st election. But that said, if you either really cared about the moon applying to Venus directly or really wanted to focus on 6th house matters for some reason, like health or work, around 7:45 p.m. later that day, you could get an early Sagittarius rising election. And that's going to be, so the moon will, at this point, be past its sextile to Mars and applying directly to the conjunction with Venus. And if you do like about 4 degrees of Sagittarius rising or so, then it'll still be a day chart. And so Jupiter will be its most benefic in its own sign of Sagittarius in the 1st house. It is squaring the midheaven at this particular location. If you do early Sagittarius rising, that may be a little different in different places. And then I actually chose 20 degrees of Virgo rising so that it would trine Venus and help it out of its cadent 6th house position. The one thing that's not as great about this particular chart is you can't simultaneously do that with both the moon and Venus. And normally you would want to do that, for the moon as well.
Yeah, there's no way to mitigate the moon.
Right, exactly. So I'm not saying this is a better chart, but it is another chart you can use that day if you're still doing things that day, and or if you really wanted to do something focused on 6th house matters. Maybe even like pets, like buying a pet.
Buying a pet, yeah.
Yeah.
It was funny.
Or health matters, 1st and 6th, are really good here.
Like sometimes those seem like minor or like small things to use a big electional chart for, but then sometimes they really do go much better and can be worth it, or surprisingly worth it.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, there are different pets. There are ones that bark their heads off all day, and there are very placid, sweet ones.
Right.
So, this is a good one for a placid, sweet one, although Jupiter is kind of spirited. But in any case, it's not a Mercury-Mars pet.
Yeah, you must have a better perception of Sagittarius energy than I do.
I was going to say it'll be spirited, but Moon Venus.
All right.
Moon Venus and Taurus. Yeah, so I mean, and not everyone's going to buy a pet this month, but I'm just throwing that out there. That's a good topic. But health things as well, because the 1st house and the 6th house are really positive here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Mars is in the 8th, so some potential not great financial things or things related to inheritance, other people's possessions, shared resources, or mortality is a no-go for this chart.
Exactly.
Even though it's otherwise actually not bad for partnership things in general, with the 7th house placements relatively well situated.
Right. Exactly.
All right. Do you have any other variations?
No, that's all.
Okay.
I will let you go.
I am going to go collapse on the couch.
Yeah.
Thank you for your valiant electional work this month. I will be not doing anything until the later part of May.
Just hold off on everything.
I mean, luckily that's when everything's happening.
I know.
Like everything between now and then is going to be us preparing for this huge conference.
Yeah, definitely.
And getting lectures together. So that's actually kind of fortuitous.
Yeah, it's nice. And for anyone who is going to be at NORWAC, I mean, there's going to be a lot of great charts happening during that time. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's it for this episode of the Auspicious Elections podcast. I still don't know what episode number this is. It's got to be somewhere in the early 20s.
Yeah.
But we thank you, everybody, for your support. I guess this is the first Auspicious Elections we've done in the new place.
It is. Yeah.
So this is kind of exciting. And obviously, I'm messing with the cameras the whole time as we're doing this and still getting the hang of it, but having fun. Yeah, so thanks everybody for supporting our work. We hope you're able to use these elections and put them to good purpose and hopefully not use them for terrible things, because we disavow
any responsibility.
any responsibility for that.
Yeah.
Do
let us know if you use any of these charts and how things went. We always love to hear that.
Yeah, we always love hearing stories about how certain elections have turned out. There's somebody actually I meant to send you. I don't know if I sent it to you, but they applied for a Norwalk scholarship using roughly one of our electional charts, and they got it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so I was going to send that to you at some point.
Okay, yeah.
I think it was one of the Virgo ones, if I remember correctly.
Okay, cool.
So that's cool. So we always love hearing that. So if you guys have any cool stories, please be sure to let us know. All right. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
All right. See you next time. Thank you.